Yes, sir.
We're good.
We are good.
All right. Okay, well, good morning and welcome. I don't know which camera to look at. Which camera? That one. Okay. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to those of you in the room and others who are watching online. My name is Steve Denny. I'm an elder and currently serving on the session. I have the great privilege of also chairing the Christian Formation Steering Committee. And I'd like to start this morning with a prayer. Would you join me in bowing your heads? Dear God, thank you for this gathering to help build up our spirit and understanding, and in doing so, build up this church and the world we live in. The prophet Jeremiah perceived you as a potter, saying, "Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." We are grateful to be clay in your loving hands and to be formed and reformed as Christians. Today, open our ears and minds and hearts to better understand your word and to put it into practice. Amen.
Amen.
Before introducing today's presenter, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some important Christian formation activities coming up, starting as a reminder. Our Dessert and Dialogue is coming up. It's going to be held on Sunday, February 27th at 7 p.m., both in person here in the Haverkamp room as well as online. The Reverend Bruce Ray's Chow, moderator of the 218th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, pastor of First Presbyterian Church, Palo Alto, California, will speak on his most recent book, In Defense of Kindness, Why It Matters, How It Changes Our Lives, and How It Can Save the World. And in addition to the Dessert and Dialogue on the 27th, you can sign up to participate in small group discussions that are going to be taking place over the next 2 weeks. Second, I want to announce that we have a very exciting Lenten series for this time, the adult Sunday school time, called Art and Crucifixion, Suffering, Beauty, and Life Through the Ages. The first class will be Sunday, March 6th, and I encourage you to watch the bulletin and the e-gram for more details. It should be sensational. And speaking of sensational, this is the second of a four-part series called Bringing the Signs of Our Times to Our Reading of Scripture, presented by Dr. Anthony Tambasco. I told him coming in, I think I last saw him in this room 15 years ago. So delighted he's back. He retired a few years ago from Georgetown University, where he was the professor of biblical studies and social ethics in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and he was that for 35 years. He's the author of 5 books, editor of 3, and is a frequent speaker, and has been, in adult education venues, including this church. He's active in the Goodwin House Life Plan community at Bailey's Crossroads. And he sings in the choir and is a member of their board of directors, Dr. Tambasco. So pleased to have you join us.
Good to be back, and again, welcome to everybody here and on Zoom. I was listening when he described the dessert and dialogue, and was wondering how you would do the dessert part on Zoom. I'm hoping that at some point our internet and television and all of that will figure out how to get taste and smell to us, and then that would be perfect. Anyway, as was announced, we have a four-part series, and it's basically trying to help you move into this theme for the whole year of rekindling the spirit. And what I've been trying to do is to show that when we rekindle the spirit, we just can't go back to what was before the pandemic and what was before all of the incidents that have unfolded for this whole past couple of years. And so in rekindling the spirit, we need to move forward. And so I was trying to kind of take the biblical text to help us to move forward, but taking the biblical text, especially in the light of everything that's happened over the past couple of years. So one of the things that I tried to stress last week, and I kept putting it up on the screen, and we'll use it for all 4 weeks, is the Hermeneutic Circle. And what I wanted to do is to talk why I start with that and why we kind of keep referring back to that. When we recognize what's going on in our lives, we need to bring all of that to our reading of the scriptures. So going to the Bible and trying to rekindle our spirits in the light of everything that has happened means that what we need to do is to read everything in the light of what happened. So one of the things I like to stress is that the big discovery of the last century or two is what I would describe as historical conditioning. In other words, we are all creatures of time and place. That's historical. So we are conditioned by our history. We are conditioned by where we are in time and place, which means that everything that we do always comes out of that perspective. So when we want to go to the Bible and we want to figure out how does the Bible help us to rekindle our spirits, we need to do that always in the hindsight of where we are in time and place. So the pandemic has taught us a whole lot of things. We have to be moving on to a new place and a new time, right, as we move along. So we can't ignore the past experiences that we've had, and we have to bring that to our reading of the scriptures. Another way in which I framed that last week was to say we have to read the signs of the times. So you don't just do theology. You don't try to figure out who's God, who are we, what's the church, and now where can I go apply it? What we have to do is start with the questions. Start with the signs of the times. Start with where we are in time and place, and see what kind of questions those raise for us that then we want to bring to the Bible and we want to find in the Bible. So what we're recognizing is that we are all historically conditioned. We have to see where we are in time and place, see how that influences our reading of the Bible, and then begin to use the Bible to enter into dialogue with our time and place and to figure out how we keep moving forward. One of the signs of the times that I tried to stress last week and that I'm stressing for all 4 weeks was the exposure to racism that the pandemic revealed for us. So if we want to read one salient sign of the time, I think, well, we could say it's human frailty. We could say that it's human fallibility. We could say that the sickness has exposed all kinds of things in terms of what we are as human beings. But one of the other things primarily that the pandemic revealed to us is how it affected especially the people in minority positions. And I'm thinking especially of the Black community, although I think we can extend it out to people of color, to many different minority groups, but that people felt the pandemic in uneven ways, right? And it exposed for us, I think, the ingrained aspects of racism in our own community. So it forced us to look at that issue. And you remember that in the middle of the pandemic, we also had George Floyd. We also had Black Lives Matter. We also had a whole lot of things that kept calling attention to the fact that the pandemic was affecting people unequally. And so racism, I would describe as one of the signs of the times. And what we have to do is get a handle on that. Get a handle on the depth with which racism has taken part of our nation, part of our country, part of our culture, and how we need to address that. So if we want to rekindle the spirit, I'd say one of the things that we need to do in rekindling the spirit is to begin to tackle the issue of racism. So then we want to go to the Bible, and we want to read the Bible to figure out how does it feed that desire to rekindle the spirit, especially in terms of racism. So I said, if we're going to do that, then we need to pay attention to what the Bible tells us about racism and how we can begin to attack it. And then it got more complicated than that, right? And it got more complicated because last week I said, when we read the Bible, we need to recognize that we are historically conditioned, and so is the Bible, right? So the Bible is the Word of God, but the Word of God always in human experience. It's the Word of God always coming by way of people who are in their own time and place. And so the Bible is not just an abstract book up there giving all kinds of doctrine about God that we go apply. The Bible itself is kind of wrestling with its own historical context to try to talk about the issues of who God is and what we are, the church. So we have to do a number of things when we go to the Bible, recognizing its historical conditioning and our historical conditioning. And so we have to read with a certain kind of methodology. So you see why it got complicated, and you see why now I have on the board what we spent all of our time with last week, the Hermeneutic Circle, right? Which is a big fancy word, Hermeneutic Circle. What does that mean? It's a circle of methodology, a circle that tries to tell us or help us to appreciate how to interpret the Bible. So you can't just go to the Bible and say, well, it says this, so it's the Word of God, and now I go apply it. What we have to do is figure out in a hermeneutic circle, in a circle of interpretation, how do I read this biblical text? And then what can I get from that biblical text that talks to me? But how am I bringing their historical conditioning and my historical conditioning to the text, and then have the text talk to me so that there's a dialogue back and forth, so that the Bible talks to my signs of the times, and my signs of the times help me to see what's in the Bible, right? So another way in which I kind of framed this last week was to say, you only get out of the Bible, or the answers out of the Bible, for the questions that you're asking. So if we don't have the right sets of questions, and then we don't pose those questions to the Bible out of our signs of the times and out of our experiences, then we don't get the answers we're looking for, right? So we have to recognize where we are in time and place, where the Bible is in time and place, and then bring that to our reading of the text, and then have the text confront us, back and forth, okay? So all of that led me to the Hermeneutic Circle. And what does the Hermeneutical Circle say? The Hermeneutical Circle says you have to start with life situation. So if you look at the bottom left of the circle, it says start with life situation. That's my signs of the times. That's my historical conditioning. That's where I recognize that I'm in time and place. That influences how I read the Bible. I have to start with that life situation. And then that will raise certain questions. So what life situation are we looking at? What signs of the times are we looking at? Well, I described last week, and I've said again this morning, we're looking at the issue of racism. We're looking at the issue of oppression. We're looking at the issue of minority groups. We're looking at the issues of those people who have suffered, especially from the pandemic, and we want to see things from their life situation, from their perspectives. So they're the ones who are raising the questions for us, and those are the questions we want to bring to the Bible. So if we look at those life situations, if we look especially at those particular signs of the times, if we look at those questions that are being raised for us in our own lives about the issue of racism, then what we do is we start going to the Bible, and we go to our theology, and we go to all the ways in which we've kind of been interpreting texts and doing theology, and we now raise issues in terms of all of those things by way of the particular signs of the times or the life situation that we're looking at. So I said the first thing that happens when you go with these questions and this signs of the times is you begin to cast suspicion on the way in which you've been looking at things. So one way in which people kind of describe how we need to read the Bible is to say the first thing you need to do is to kind of raise questions and expose the limitations of biblical texts, or expose the limitations of how we've been reading biblical texts, right? So that you kind of cast suspicion on whether or not you've been reading them adequately. So to reframe that for our particular context, I would say, where does the Bible show its limitations in terms of oppression, in terms of minority groups, or in terms of slavery, right? And almost our minds go right away to the fact, well, the Bible has slaves all over the place, right? So when we say, where are the limitations of the text? Well, the limitations of the text is that the Bible doesn't eliminate slavery in its writing. So what we have to do is cast suspicion on those particular aspects of the Bible and begin to raise questions about whether or not we've had an adequate reading of the Bible, or even whether or not the Bible is giving us an adequate presentation on the issue of slavery. So we have to expose the limitations. We have to expose the ways in which the Bible itself is limited in how it presents things. It's a text in time and place, and it's not going to say everything about everything in every generation. So when we have new signs of the times, when we have new insights, we have to bring that to the Bible, and we have to critique the Bible in some ways. Now, what does that do? Well, if we keep moving along in our hermeneutic circle, we have life situation that raises hermeneutic suspicion, or suspicion about ways in which we've interpreted the Bible, or suspicions about whether or not the Bible gives us an adequate presentation on things. And then what does that do? That causes us to start rethinking our ways of doing things, right? So we rethink our picture of God. We rethink our picture of church or community. We start rethinking our theology. And then when we begin to rethink it, so now we're up at the kind of the, what is it, the 2 o'clock part of the circle, okay? When we start rethinking our theology, and what that does is it kind of pushes us to go back and to look at our biblical texts, right? And when we look at our biblical texts, we look at them with a new light. We look at them in new ways. And so we've got a circle. And then once we look at them in new ways, they feed into a new life situation. And they begin to help us to act differently, to see things differently. And then that life situation is going to affect how we start looking at texts. And then it's going to have us start rethinking things. And then it's going to have us go back to the Bible. And what we begin to recognize is that you have a hermeneutic circle, because in fact, life situation is constantly interacting with Bible and theology and Bible are interacting with life situation. So it keeps going on and on. And I say it's kind of like a cycle, right? Up higher and higher, right? So it's not a vicious circle, right? But it is cyclical, but it keeps getting better and better. I pointed out that in fact, what happens is when you start paying attention to a hermeneutic circle, you keep recognizing that there are more and more situations of oppression, more and more situations where people say, you haven't heard my point of view, you haven't seen me where I am in time and place, you need to listen to me. And so that's going to affect how we read texts, and then that's going to affect how we redo theology, how we read the Bible, and then it's going to come back again to more life situations. So what we found is that in fact, there are lots and lots of movements of interpretation of the Bible, and lots of groups that just keep getting in there and keep saying, you haven't seen it from my point of view. So we started out with Latin American liberation theology, right? And this was concerns of the poor in Latin America especially. But then the Blacks said, you haven't heard my point of view, and all of that. And then the women among the Blacks said, you haven't heard my point of view. And then we started with womanist theology, right? And then we had the Latin Americans saying, you haven't paid any attention to machismo and to the women, right? And then in this first world, we began to get feminist theology. So they began to say, you have to look at our signs of the times. So you see how you have a lot of different movements, right? And all those movements are affecting how we read the biblical text. right? And that's what's going on all the time. And that's why I say it's cyclical, because every time we think we've got all the liberation movements taken care of and we're freeing everybody, somebody else comes along and says, you haven't seen it from my point of view. So I could do a whole series of lectures now on queer theology, right? And the gays, another whole movement, right? And there's always going to be more movements, right? That say, you haven't heard my point of view. So we've got a lot of the principal movements out in terms of women, in terms of race, in terms of social class or, poverty issues. Latinos are beginning to do it. And then the Latinas said, you're not paying attention to me, even you Latinos, right? So each group keeps bringing up more issues. So that's where we were on the Hermeneutic Circle last time. I gave kind of an overview. And today, what I want to do is just spend a little time on the first part of that circle. After you have life situation or you're kind of asking questions, especially from the point of view of racism, right? And what we've experienced in terms of the pandemic. Now, the first step is casting hermeneutical suspicion. So today, I would describe all of this as kind of the bad news, right? So we're looking at biblical texts and we're saying, where is the Bible limited in its point of view? Where is the Bible ultimately not advocating all the things that we need to talk about? So what we have to do first is expose the limitations of biblical texts. And that's what I'm doing today. And then next week, we say, now, where can I begin to retrieve traditions in the biblical text, retrieve traditions that will begin to kind of foster my addressing the issues of racism today? And then in the last lecture, how can I take the general teaching of the Bible, kind of the principal ways in which the Bible operates, and how can I begin to make application of those things, especially to the issues of racism? So how can I take other parts of a biblical text and then make application, especially in terms of the issue of racism? And that, I hope, will give us lots of wherewithal for rekindling the spirit. And then we have the unenviable task of figuring out how to apply all of that in life situation today, and how do I start solving this problem? But I think the first thing we need to recognize is that all of our life situation and even biblical texts are pushing us to make this a central issue. If you want to rekindle the spirit, you just can't go back to a nice spirituality that ignores the issues that have been raised for us in the pandemic issue, right? So that's where we are. So today, we kind of, I guess I call it exposing the limitations of biblical texts. So we ask ourselves, what do we need to do in terms of biblical text? Well, there are, I think, two ways in which we can look at biblical texts or their limitations. And then I want to give a little background to all of that before we get to texts themselves. But I think one is, where do the texts themselves begin to show limitations? And that, as I've said already, we've got texts that are just loaded with slavery, right? And so we have to know, what do we do with those texts? What are they all about? But then we also have to look not only at texts that show themselves to be limited, but also how have we begun to take biblical texts over the centuries, right? And especially in modern times, how have we taken biblical texts and used them to reinforce the problems of racism? So it's not the Bible itself that would be at fault here, but our interpretation of biblical texts that kind of led to that difficulty. Now, I recognize one of the things that I'm doing here, in effect, is taking the lecture that Larry Haywood gave to all of you, a couple of months ago, I guess, when you already recognize you need to recognize the issue of racism, and you've had some lectures already on these issues in terms of the history of this church, the history of Presbyterianism, and then Larry gave one on biblical studies. So what I'm taking are a lot of the things that he talked about and just kind of stretching them out. I think you need to hear them more than once, and maybe some people didn't go to that lecture, right? But you'll recognize that a number of the texts that I'm kind of drawing on are texts that Larry talked about. But he had them in just one part of his talk. What I'm doing is kind of stretching it out over 3 weeks here, and to take all of those texts and to look at them in a little bit more detail, to try to just ingrain within us how the texts themselves are limited, and also to kind of get the sense of how sometimes we, in our limitations, read texts to kind of foster the issues or the problems, right? So let me just show how it gets more complicated. And I think this is helpful for our own appreciation of what's going on, and it helps us to see why racism is such a problem. I think just by way of general background, we need to recognize that racism is really a modern problem in that the Bible doesn't recognize Black races as a problem, right? So the establishment of racism itself probably came out of the time when they began to kidnap people from Africa in order to feed the Industrial Revolution, or in order to give, even before that, labor that was needed in various parts of the first world, or the discovery of Latin America, right? So at that time, so about 1500s, 1600s, you begin to get the kidnapping of Blacks from Africa and the transporting of them to the New World or to Europe in order to provide labor, right? Then it's at that point, people decided that they needed also to justify all of this. And then you began to get the concept of racism. And then you begin to get the concept that Blacks are inferior to whites, right? Which is the problem of the racism. So in the biblical world, they don't know the difference between Black, white, blue, or whatever. Now they have racism, right? But their racism is not in terms of Black and white. It's not in terms of the African community and us. It's in terms of captured populations. So there's always kind of a sense of superiority over other groups, but sometimes the superiority is over, whites and whites, or groups that are the same color, right? And so it's not a racial kind of prejudice as we would understand it, although there were all kinds of superiority and inferiority problems, even in the biblical world, right? So the Romans were the center of the empire. If they captured other people, then those people were considered inferior, and you had slavery, right? So we kind of put the overlay of Blacks as slaves when racism developed later on. So I remember back, my study of history, and the history of the discovery of the New World, and then the gradual importation of slaves, and then also even the indigenous populations of Latin America, right, that were being looked at. And you had big debates going on in Europe over whether or not the slaves or these populations were human, right? And so you probably heard the name Bartolomé de las Casas, was a famous Dominican priest in Latin America. And de las Casas, who worked with the indigenous population and who worked also with the slaves who were imported and saw their humanity and understood what they were all about, he went back to Europe and he had a big fight with a famous Spanish theologian, Juan de Sepulveda, right? Juan de Sepulveda. And de Sepulveda was trying to justify the fact that we could have a slave trade and that Spain and Portugal could divide up Latin America and they could have slave trade. If you saw the Mission, the movie The Mission, it was all about the Jesuits trying to save the indigenous population by bringing them over to communes. They call them the reducciones, right? But they tried to separate them out. And then what happened is the Portuguese and the Spanish started to have fights over who was going to have control of the slave trade. And they were annoyed at the Jesuits for taking their population away. They wanted slaves. And so by the end of the mission, everybody was slaughtered. And all the people that were being hidden away in the, often in the jungle areas in these reducciones, right, were taken back and made slaves, right? So this was a big problem, but it was around 1600s or so that you begin to get that debate, right? And it started in Europe, but then it kind of moved in many other places. And it was always a debate, over whether or not these populations were inferior. So then you have a black-white kind of issue of racism, although I'd say racism is around both. You remember the big over Whoopi Goldberg, right? Whoopi Goldberg oversimplified the whole issue of racism, right? So I said, well, the Jews are all white, right? So this isn't racism. Well, there are other forms of racism, right? When you've got superiority, inferiority, and you've got, an Aryan race claiming that even the Jews are another race, right? But so it's not always in our categories today, but in similar kinds of categories. So in the biblical world, how did you get slaves? You didn't get slaves by going to capture Black population. You got slaves every time you won a battle, right? So when the Romans conquered another country, they could take people out of that country and make them slaves. So it was a kind of inferiority, superiority relationship. And in some ways that could be described as racial, right? But it wasn't necessarily Black population. One of the other things to keep in mind that's really interesting when we talk about, our own assumptions and presuppositions around how we read biblical text, and the racism issues, we always look at Blacks as if they came later into Christianity, right? So one of the things I want to talk about is how we, the Black churches developed and how, we kind of brought them in terms of how we wanted to use that Bible for racial purposes. But we assume all the time that Blacks came in later, right? So they came over as pagans from Africa or elsewhere, and then eventually we gave them Christianity. Well, if you look at the history, and this is now in terms of Black and white, right? And to try to teach us in our own mentalities and how we're kind of looking at racism. But if you look back at the history of early Christianity, Northern Africa and the Black population in Northern Africa was there way before most of Europe in terms of Christianity, right? So a lot of our ancestors didn't even know about Christianity, and there was already a huge Black population of Christians. So Augustine of Hippo, right? Augustine of Hippo. You can go back 200 years even before him, and you have Cyprian of Carthage, right? And he's a Berber, right? But you've got all of Northern Africa, right? And then, of course, everybody is always fighting, are you Black? Are you not Black? They say, oh, well, they're white, right? And then we've got a whole concept of racism that says, well, if you have one drop of Black blood, you're Black, right? It's just, they're all artificial categories. They make no sense at all, right? They don't make any sense. And we can't even figure out what the races are anymore. But in any case, notwithstanding all of that, Northern Africa was a vibrant church for a long time. Carthage, Hippo, a number of other towns, Tunisia, all of those areas, usually Catholic. And then what happened is the Ottoman Empire came in, swept everything out. That was the end of Christianity. And then we have this viewpoint that all of Africa was pagan, and then we converted them to Christianity later on. So it just creates a different kind of mentality. And I think it would help us to understand things better if we look at all of that historical conditioning, right? And that kind of just underlays a lot of the biblical text. So with that as kind of a background, let me just say, let's go to the biblical text and expose again the issues in the biblical text. So in view of what I've said, I don't think we can expose in the biblical text their concept of racial prejudice that we would know, because for them, Black, white was not the issue, right? But I think we can see the limitations of the biblical text in terms of slavery, right? So that I think we need to raise. Now, what happens when we go to biblical text and we look at slavery? Well, I think the first thing we recognize is that the Bible does not see the ability of eliminating slavery, right? So if we want to expose the limitations of the biblical text, I think it's going to be especially where they keep assuming that slavery is part of the organization. So the Old Testament has it, although I would say that in the biblical mentality, Judaism, right, always had a sense that you, first of all, could not enslave fellow Jews, didn't like that. And then they always had these Jubilee laws and other things that said, I've got slaves, right? but I have to free them in the Jubilee year, right? And things of that sort. So there's always kind of in some way mitigating circumstances. And maybe those are things that we can look at in the when we go to the next phases of our reading the Bible. How can we retrieve traditions that are still helpful for us? And then how can we begin to take other general principles and apply them? I think the Bible itself tries to do that in some way with slavery, but I think we need to recognize that they could not conceive of a world where you didn't have superiors, inferiors, and you didn't have slaves in some way, right? And that's a limitation, and you can't simply take a Bible and apply it, right? So there's a problem with all of that. I think even in the New Testament, you have that problem. So there's a book that you might want to read that I think is helpful for all of this. It's by Kane Felder. Kane Felder, he's my generation, so most of the books I know, my generation, right? But Kane Felder just died not too long ago, and he was a retired professor by that time. But he has a book that still seems current because they actually just put out a new edition of it. He has a book called Stony the Road We Trod. Stony the Road We Trod. And he's an editor of that book, and then there are contributions from any number of people. Some of them, in fact, were younger scholars who are now, in the prime of their careers. But in any case, Stony the Road We Trod is celebrating its 30th anniversary. And since all the things they laid out in that book is kind of the underpinnings for a Black liberation theology from a biblical perspective, all of those things are still pertinent, although we hope that we're building on it, since then. But anyway, it's about 30 years old, and all of the articles still relevant. And I recognize some of the people in there, they were very young when they started, and now they're the leaders in a lot of this. One of the things that's really fascinating about all of this, though, again, it's kind of background, is that there are not a whole lot of Black biblical scholars. So when we want to go to kind of learn from them, there's still a real minority group. And you can see again where poverty probably created a lot of that, right? And the racism that kind of created some of the issues in terms of education, in terms of scholarships, in terms of the ability to kind of move into the ranks of Black scholarship, probably prejudice also in terms of tenure process and hiring and things like that. I mean, all of these things kind of fed into a factor that said there were very few biblical scholars. If you want to become a biblical scholar, you have to learn all the languages, right? You have to go through a long process of education. Then you have to go find a job, and then you got to get tenure, right? And so lots of Black scholars just say, that's not worth my trouble, right? So I'm not going to do that. So you don't have a whole lot of biblical scholars who have mastery of historical critical methodology, who have mastery of biblical scholarship, and who can contribute to the field. So there's still handfuls of them, right? So it's growing in number, but the percentage is still single digits, compared to a Black population that is double digits, right? That's about 30% of the country. So you got maybe 5-8%, of scholars are Black scholars. So all of that, I think, kind of feeds into the problem, but it's also why I think this book still has prominence and importance, because this is still laying the foundations, and those scholars are still giving us the principles and the methodologies for kind of moving forward. So they're doing a lot of the Hermeneutic Circle in that book, right? And you'll find interesting articles there. But the book by Kane Felder, or the article by Kane Felder in this book that he edited, makes two interesting points about how the Bible ended up still kind of promoting slavery, and then not moving far enough, at least from our historical perspective, to eliminate slavery, right? So it was mitigated in some ways, but slavery is still slavery, right? And we have to be careful not to take the arguments of the South all the time that says, well, my slaves were part of the household, and they loved me, and I loved them. I mean, slavery is still slavery, and people have no freedom. They have no ability to make their own choices and decisions. Their life is pre-programmed for them. I mean, slavery is still a problem. So even, when I say, well, there are mitigating circumstances, I don't want to start saying, so slavery was really nice in the biblical world. And in fact, I would say, no matter where you were, I mean, some slaves in the biblical world conducted the business of a household. They traveled internationally. They did the trade. They brought the money in, to the master of the house, but they're still not free, right? But then there were other kinds of slaves who worked out on the farm or worked in the mines, and their situation just can't be described as nice no matter how you slice it, right? I mean, they've got drudgery of day-to-day work all the time. So slavery is there. So even though I say it may be mitigated, that all has to be qualified and not say, so it was good. I think Kane Felder makes 2 points about the what happened in terms of slavery that's helpful for our general categories. He said one of the things was what he called sacralization. In other words, what happened was we took political ideologies, or we took what was kind of the given economic political situation, slavery, and then we made it sacred, right? So sacralization, we then gave it religious underpinnings, right? And the religious underpinnings were supporting all of those structural institutions that now, from our point of view, we recognize are simply untenable. And then he said the other side of what happened is that we sometimes had kind of good principles religiously, biblically, and from Revelation, good principles, right, of all of our community together and our equality and our need to kind of support one another. And then what happened was it became secularized. So the religious principles yielded to what went on in terms of the political establishment, because our principles were creating too many problems in terms of the society. It was challenging society. And so to keep peace, we simply gave up a lot of those religious principles. And so what we had was kind of a secularization. So I think the categories are helpful because they kind of have the wheels turning in our own head, right? Of where sometimes, we take what is a given situation and we make it God's word, right? And we make it God's will, right? And that's a problem. Or sometimes we know that we need to challenge things and then we just get tired of challenging things and we get blowback, right? And people get angry at us, right? Whether they accuse us of being woke, and then people say, well, I'm going to give up on that, right? Too much trouble. And then we kind of give in to the secular society. So Kane Felder says both those things go on, and some of those things go on in the biblical text themselves, or if they don't go on in the biblical text, they go on in the way we read the biblical text, right? So what are examples? Well, he says you want a good example of sacralization. He said, just look at the genealogies in the Old Testament, right? So these are the children of Noah and the curse of Ham or Canaan, right? And Larry talked about these things before, but you can also find them, in other places. 1 Chronicles has some of these lists, and it's one way in which they took the given situations of who's superior, who's inferior, or who do we want to be superior, or who we don't want to be superior, and then we'll put them in genealogies, right? And we'll say that's the way God created the world. So what you have in Genesis 10, it starts in Genesis 9, and then it goes to Genesis 10. And in fact, it's really complicated because you have 2 different traditions who gave us these sources, and the traditions don't even agree with each other. They say that maybe on one hand, they're kind of dealing with a general genealogy of the nations, and in another one, they're bringing in a whole lot of politics, right? So it gets complicated even there. But if you look at what's behind all of it, it seems that they took what was the given political situation and then they made it God's creation, right? So what's basically behind these genealogies is the 3 children of Noah. And in Genesis 10, the 3 children of Noah are given all the nations in the world, right? At that time, right? But what they did was divide the whole world up in terms of the 3 kids. Now, that's Genesis 10 that kind of extended it out, internationally, if you want, to the unknown world at that point. But if you go to chapter 9, it's even more limited. And this is where I say a lot of politics got in there, right? So who were really the people that they were trying to get at in terms of these genealogies or the three children? Well, they wanted to account for the Philistines, for the Canaanites, for the Israelites, and for the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, right? That was their world. They didn't really care about, what's at the other end of Asia, or what's at the other end of eventually Europe, right? They wanted to deal with their own sphere. So you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And Japheth seems to be responsible for the Asians who came into the land, and eventually the Philistines, right? And then you have Seth, Ham, Japheth, and Seth. And so Shem, not Seth. Shem is the father of the Semites, and he represents the Israelites, right? So you've got the Asians who came in, that included the Philistines, right? And then you have the Semitic peoples, right, or the Hebrews, and then you have Ham is supposed to be the father of Egypt and maybe Mesopotamia and some of these other lands. So you have three children, and probably initially those genealogies were just trying to take care of where they were right there. Now, what's their issue primarily? Well, Shem is going to be the important guy, right? So when you start doing the genealogy, Shem, who is the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, or Israel, is going to figure prominently, right? And then what happens is they want to show that, in fact, the Canaanites have to be subordinate. So here's a kind of racism, right? But it's not black and white, but it's superior and inferior. In fact, one of the interesting things in biblical studies right now is they actually think that there was no ethnic difference between Israelites and Canaanites. That, in fact, Israelites were some of the Canaanites who seceded from the rest of the group and set themselves up as an egalitarian community, right? So in terms of race, just forget about your categories. They don't work, right? Everybody's from the same ethnic origins, right? But then what happens is you start getting racial concerns, right? Or ethnic concerns that the Semites are going to be better than the Canaanites. So what do you end up getting? You end up getting a story, right? That shows how the Canaanites have to be good slaves for the Israelites, right? So what happens? You have the story of Ham. And this is the other interesting thing, right? Ham is the guy involved with all of this, but Ham is going to be the father of Canaan, right? And then the father of Egypt, right? But Ham shames his father, right? By seeing him naked. So in the biblical world, shame is the big thing, right? Honor and shame. So Ham sees his father naked, and so he shames his father, and so Ham gets cursed. But then when you go down and you read the poem, right, of Ham being cursed, it's not Ham who gets cursed, it's his son Canaan who gets cursed. So I'm trying to figure out, well, who even gets cursed here, right? But you see, the point of that whole story was really the story of the geography right in that area, and the Semites fighting the Canaanites, or the ancestor of the Canaanites, right? And then fighting the Philistines, who belong to Japheth, right, the Asian community. So it's a very localized kind of thing. Its limitations is that it still has superior, inferior, and who's better than everybody else, and then slavery, right? But what happens is Shem now is going to be superior to Ham and his son Canaan, and then you hear Canaanites and all of that. And so Israel is going to be over the Canaanites. And in fact, the little poem at the end of chapter 9 even says that Shem will dominate over Canaan, right? And Canaan will be a slave. And then it also says Japheth will come in, and Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be his slave, right? So Japheth and the descendants of Japheth dwelling in the tents of Shem, right, is a reference to the Philistines who came down and inhabited the coast the Holy Land, right? And then also conquered the Canaanites. So you have Semites and Philistines against Canaanites, and it all gets reflected in a nice genealogy, right? So that's a sacralization, right? So they take secular ideologies, they take all of their fights, and then they put them in biblical texts, right? So we have to recognize those limitations and then not start using them. And of course, that's the problem of what happened, not only in what the biblical text said, right, that already has some limitations, but then what happened, well, in this country, people love that story. And then they took that story and they said, so you see, blacks have to be slaves and blacks have to serve the whites, right? So taking the Bible totally out of its historical context, but then using it for their historical context to advocate slavery. So what we have to say is we got to get rid of that, right? We have to cast hermeneutical suspicion on that stuff and not take limitations of biblical text for our own use. Then the last point that I would make again, and Larry referred to it, is a good example of secularization, and that's in the New Testament, right? So the New Testament, you have all of these household codes, and the household codes say, slaves, obey your masters. Now, it also says masters, love your slaves, right? But it still has slaves. So what happened? Well, you have all different versions of what happened. They think that, the Christian world simply took over what was already there in the Roman Empire and simply assumed that you can't exist without slaves. So what are we going to do for social order? We can't create chaos. So we're going to just, Christianize it. So they took all the Christian principles and applied it to household codes that was still there and said, well, now what we're going to do is at least soften it by saying, masters, love your slaves. And slaves, obey your master as one in faith, and you love one another. So they kind of Christianized the slave codes, right? In that same text, they have wives being submissive to husbands, and we all no problems with that, right? But that's another whole oppressive movement, right? And it's another whole, liberation movement that we need to look at. So in those household codes, they began to see kind of a secularization, if you want, of which was kind of a giving up on what the principles of Christianity of being one big family and just kind of giving into the Roman Empire at that point and saying, we'll just keep slavery here. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who's done a lot of work on feminist issues, also kind of gives us material here for the slavery and the black and white issue. And she says what happened was that, again, to keep peace, people kind of backed off. So that original Christianity was a discipleship of equals, right? That everybody had a role. And in fact, we think in the early church, women led congregations, right? Or they led their households, right? And they had prominent roles and they had ministries within the church. And that, in fact, even slaves were free, right, to join. And then what happened was that created a lot of headaches, right? A lot of trouble. And so gradually it all got reduced, right? And so then you end up with a secularization of the principles to accommodate what's going on in the empire around them. So it tells us again, and this was another set of texts that they love to take in modern times, right? When slavery came along and said, obey your masters, right? And so when the slave owners in this country decided that they were going to Christianize people, right? They wanted to Christianize them so that the slaves would then pay attention to the genealogies, the curse of Ham, and so that the slaves would then pay attention to the household codes, and they'd be able to use Christianity as a way of keeping everybody under control. And of course, the slaves went from their own historical perspectives, and the slaves became Christian, not to read the biblical text the way the slave owners were reading it, but to read the biblical text the way they wanted to read it. And that will lead us to the next set of talks, right? And the next part of the hermeneutic circle of how the blacks began to read these texts to retrieve traditions out of those texts, right? So to kind of renew the theology first by retrieving the traditions that were lost. And then it moves on to more general principles. So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah.
couple minutes.